Thomas Alva Edison once said, I have not failed. I have found 10,000 ways that won't work. I may not have erred 10,000 times in my process of writing and publishing my first novel, but I have made my fair share of mistakes in the 10 years it took me to get my novel published. Yes, you heard right, it took me 10 years, but for those of you who are not published, do not panic, because my story is a little bit different and unique. First of all, I never intended to be a writer. I was a visual artist, and in fact, I studied, as Rob said, I studied painting. And I ended up working for a couple of years as a graphic designer and an illustrator for a newspaper. But looking back at who I was back then as a child, I think I always had a writer inside of me. Because like even when I played Barbies, I didn't want to play with anybody because I wanted to write my own stories and tell my own stories. And I didn't want to play husband and wife and kids. I wanted to make these dramatic stories where people were dying and cheating on the spouses and everything. So I think that writer was inside of me somehow. The Sisters of Alameda Street first came to mind in 1998, but I had envisioned it as a soap opera. My dream was to have it produced in Mexico or Colombia or Chile or where some of my favorite soap operas were being made. The thing is, I got married to an American and moved here. So that dream was over. But it took me, but that story kept coming back and the characters kept coming back to me with time. And by 2005, I thought, well, maybe I should write it as a novel in English since I live in the United States. And so I did that. By 2007, I had a finished product. And I went to my first writers' conference, which is that conference that I'm telling you guys about today. And I met this lovely editor from Berkeley. And she requested the first 3 chapters, I think it was. And I was so excited, I thought I was going to sell my book that day. Little did I know that it was going to take 3 critique groups, 2 literary agents, 3 full rewrites, and many, many, many rejection letters for my book to find a home at Skyhorse Publishing. Exactly 10 years after my first UNM Writers Conference. As you can imagine, I made many mistakes along the road. And I have a witness right there, because she read the second draft of my novel. From these mistakes, I have learned valuable lessons to become a better writer. Tonight, I would like to share with you my 8 worst mistakes and what you can do to avoid them, so it doesn't take you that long to publish. But first, a disclaimer. I am hesitant to use the word mistake because I honestly don't think that there are fast and hard rules in something as subjective as literature. I think that what didn't work for me may work for another writer. However, I can say without a doubt that my earliest draft of my novel is nowhere near as strong as the book that finally made it to print. Before I go into my first mistake, I would like to ask you guys a question. When you are thinking about buying a book, what are some of the first things you look at? Anybody? Cover? What else? The blur, the black? The opener. And that's exactly where my mistake number 1 was. The wrong opening for my genre. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a writer in possession of a good novel must be in one of a great opening line. Openings may determine the fate of our manuscripts. An impatient editor or agent may decide to read only based on that one finicky line. With this much pressure, it's no surprise that I try to make my original opening extremely intriguing. And it was, but it didn't correspond to the genre I was writing. I'm going to read you one of the first openings I had for this book so you can understand better what I mean. So this is where I embarrass myself. Malena could still taste the iron inside her mouth. She quickened her pace. Nobody in her building could see the bloodstains on the front of her poodle's skirt. If only she could hide under the shadows of the night, but it was still so bright outside. She wrinkled her nose, feeling the sweat building up all over her face, and her fake eyelashes, which had taken such effort and precision to glue on that morning, sticking to one another. But her appearance was the least of her concerns right now. Facing her father and telling him what happened would be much worse. Based on this opening, what would you say is the genre of this book?
Mystery.
Or a thriller, right? A murder or something. Yes. Because I mentioned blood and fake eyelashes, some agents thought that this novel was going to be a thriller. My opening promised lots of action, and one agent thought that my protagonist had killed someone and was running away from the law. Well, the truth was that my main character is a nursing student. And the reason why she had blood on her skirt was because she had been helping someone with, curing a patient. And she had been at the ER that morning. She was wearing fake eyelashes because the book is set in 1962. So it was the fashion of the times. And her urgency was due to the fact that she had been kicked out of nursing school, and she was afraid of her father's reaction. In other words, I made a promise to my reader that was not truthful. The agents who requested the novel felt deceived. They were expecting a thriller, not a generational saga, which is what the genre of my book. When you start a novel, you're making a promise to your reader. You're promising an experience, an emotion, a genre. And if you fail to fulfill this promise, your reader may distrust you forever or throw your book across the room. So here are my solutions for this problem. An editor once told me that an opening has to be unique and specific to the book you're writing. In other words, it shouldn't be generic or interchangeable. No other book should start like yours. But let's look what other things a good opening would do. It has to hook and intrigue your reader. It has to be a sample of the writer's prose, the mood of the story, and of course the genre. I would like to play a short little game with you guys and read you the openings, see if you can guess what genre they are. So actually the first one I'm going to read is, I'm going to tell you what it is. It's Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because he was a master at writing compelling openers. Let's see. So this is the opening for Chronicle of a Death Foretold. On the day they were going to kill him, Santiago Nazar got up at 5:30 in the morning to wait for the boat the bishop was coming on. Here's the opening for 100 Years of Solitude. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Coronel Aureliano Buendia was to remember that distant afternoon where his father took him to discover ice. And my favorite book of his. It was inevitable. The scent of bitter almonds always reminded him of the fate of unrequited love. This is Love in the Time of Cholera. From this short samples, we can assume a few things. One, these books are not comedy. In fact, they may end very tragically, right? There is a sense of melancholy and nostalgia throughout the text. All these books it seems like they start in a climatic point of the story, and it may take the entire book to reveal to us what happened. And these novels take place in the Spanish-speaking country. All this information from just one sentence. Now let's play my little game. So, you have to imagine a British accent. Okay, I don't have it. Just think about it. I will not drink more than 14 alcohol units a week, smoke, waste money on pasta makers, ice cream machines, or other culinary devices which we'll never use, books by unreadable literary authors to put impressively on shelves, exotic underwear, since pointless as have no boyfriend, behave sluttishly around the house, but instead imagine others are watching. This is the opening of Bridget Jones' Diary. Very different mood from the earlier openings that I read, right? Here's another one. The bedroom is strange, unfamiliar. I don't know where I am, how I came to be here. I don't know how I'm going to get home. I have spent the night here. I was woken by a woman's voice. At first, I thought she was in bed with me, but then I realized she was reading the news and I was hearing a radio alarm. And when I opened my eyes, found myself here in this room I do not recognize. What do you think this genre is? It's a thriller, yeah. It's Before I Go to Sleep by S.J. Watson. Here's another. The first annoying thing is when I ask Dad what he thinks happened to Mom, he always says, what's most important is for you to understand it's not your fault. You'll notice that wasn't even the question. This is, what do you think? What? No. It's a like a dark comedy. It's Where'd You Go, Bernadette? Has anybody read that? Pretty funny. By Marie Sample. Everybody's gonna recognize this one, I think. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous verminous bug. That's literary, right? Where's Papa going with that axe? Said Fern to her mother as they were setting the table for breakfast. Does anybody know where that comes from? Charlotte's Web? Yeah. Here's my last. In my first memory, I am 3 years old and I am trying to kill my sister. What's that? It's women's fiction. It's My Sister's Keeper by Jodi Picoult. Okay, enough about openings. My mistake number 2. My protagonist was not as interesting as my secondary characters. When my agent sent my novel to acquiring editors in New York, most of the feedback was the same. My protagonist was not engaging enough. People have been telling me this for a while, but what I considered to be a minor flaw turned into a deal breaker when it came time to sell my book. Basically, my protagonist had 3 problems. 1, I didn't really know who my heroine was. I just knew what I wanted her to do. 2, in my attempt to create a vulnerable and likable heroine, I made her really passive. She just reacted but never took the initiative. She was agreeable and nice, but boring. And she was always smiling. I think you pointed that out. 3, even though she was boring, men were falling for her like flies on a piece of chocolate cake. At least 3 characters in the book were in love with her. I admit this may be an after product of watching too many telenovelas. Possible solutions. If you have more interesting secondary characters, make one of them your protagonist. If you can't do this, then learn your character's backstory. But please, don't feel the need to share every detail with your reader. Look at the people around you and borrow traits from them. Just don't tell them that you did. Read about personality types. You can use the Enneagram or the Myers-Briggs type indicator or even the Zodiac. Dissolve your heroine's fan club and just focus on the relevant stories, the relevant relationships in your story. Make your protagonist more active. Now, what is an active character? Think about Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind. You know how she takes the initiative every time? Even though she lives in the middle of this civil war, she always takes a first step to do things, right? Mistake number 3, unrealistic expectations from characters. If you're anything like me, you think of your plot first. Writers who think about the plot first sometimes try to make their characters force their characters to act in unnatural ways. Sometimes character actions don't ring true or make sense. They're like puppets in your plot. My novel is about a girl trying to find her mother among 4 sisters. When she arrives to the house where she thinks her mother lives, she meets 4 women that have the same initial, and that she's also mistaken for someone else, someone that's coming to stay for a few weeks at the house. She assumes this mistaken identity, but in my first draft, she was very happy to do it. Because I wanted to use all these humorous scenes in my book, so I had her calm and relaxed going along with the whole mistaken identity premise. Keep in mind this is in 1962, right? So she can't just blurt out, which one of you is my mother? But I had her do all these crazy things just because I wanted to write funny scenes. In reality, I think she would have been a nervous wreck and would have constantly been afraid to be discovered. So I had to adjust my plot accordingly. So what are some solutions for this? Be honest with yourself. How would you really act under the circumstances in your novel? Don't force your characters to act a certain way just because you want to use a particular setting or line of dialogue or a scene that you like. Be flexible. Even if you have your plot already outlined, understand that a certain magic happens when you're writing. And a better idea may come if you just listen to your characters. Do you realize that non-writers will think we're crazy if they hear that? Mistake number 4. Too many plots, too many characters. When I started writing my novel, my innocent goal was to tell the story of an entire town. But this proved to be very difficult because too many storylines and characters is really hard to keep track of. Plus, you take a lot of room from your main plot. I ended up with a novel that was over 150,000 words, which, as you may know, is really hard to sell, not only to an editor that doesn't know you and doesn't know if you can sell your book, but also to bookstores if you self-publish, because it takes a lot of room in the shelves, so they may not want to buy a lot of copies of your very thick book. And you might also turn off readers, because, if they see that there's 750 pages, they may not want to read it. You may say, but what about War and Peace, 100 Years of Solitude, Peyton Place? Well, I'll tell you, look at when those novels were published. Back then, literature didn't have to compete with other media like it does now. We now have books don't only compete with books, they compete with films, with television, internet, video games, you name it. Unfortunately, readers have become more impatient, so you can't give them any excuse to lose interest. Possible solutions. Condense your characters. Your protagonist may not need 3 best friends. Combine 2 characters and you may end up with a richer character that your reader may actually remember from one page to the next. Save other subplots for another novel. Or turn the novel that you have into a series, or just press delete. Mistake number 5, erratic flashbacks. Flashbacks can be a blessing or a curse. As I mentioned earlier, my brother is about a young woman trying to find her mother among 4 sisters. So I thought it'd be really important to tell the reader who these women were in their youth and how they connected to my protagonist's father. The problem was that I wrote random flashback scenes that had no relevance to the present timeline. I went on tangents because I wanted to use a particular setting or a specific event that I was interested in. To give you an example, say you write a scene of your main character's first day of kindergarten. This event, as interesting as it might be to you, should have an effect on his present for you to have brought it up. If not, you run the risk of annoying your reader. I also wrote cryptic flashback scenes that nobody understood how they related to the present or what they meant. I ended up also with an unbalanced novel because I had more flashbacks on one character that I liked more than the others. Flashbacks can be very powerful for you when you use them right. Ideally, you'll want to intrigue your reader so that they actually want to know what happened in the past. Possible solutions. Ask yourself, what is the benefit of the flashback? Does it contribute in ways that telling wouldn't? I think that a very poignant scene is a lot more effective if you tell it in the form of a flashback than if you have your character talking about it. Because this way the reader becomes a witness to the event. It's a lot more powerful. Eventually, I found a way to use my flashback scenes and work for me by giving each sister a chapter with flashback scenes. But I had to restructure the whole novel so that all the sisters have the same numbers of scenes and chapters. Plus, I also made those scenes reveal something important for the puzzle that my protagonist was trying to solve. Which leads me to my next mistake, inconsequential scenes. In my attempt to follow the show, don't tell mantra, I ended up with a lot of really short scenes. My novel was like a play where characters were coming in and reciting their lines in and out. But I didn't have enough setting or inner thought for the reader to get to know my characters. I also had a lot of repetitive scenes that didn't advance the story. In my experience, a pacing issue is usually a result of a scene or several scenes that aren't serving an important purpose. Since the novel is basically a sequence of scenes with transitional sentence and paragraphs, it's essential to evaluate each scene as a unit and also as a whole. So now I use the following criteria to determine if I need a scene. First of all, what is the purpose of this scene? As the creator of your story, you should really know why you're writing a particular scene. Is your purpose to advance the story? Is it to enlighten your reader about your character? To develop a bond or a conflict between characters? If you don't understand the purpose of your scene, you may have a problem. The next step is the scene repetitive. Do you have many similar scenes throughout? I did this. I used to have a lot of scenes where they were eating dinner. I mean, I can't help it. I like food, right? So I decided, well, maybe they can go to the park next time. Do you have a lot of conversations that are similar between the same people? Well, condense them. Also question yourself, is an entire scene necessary to convey this information? Sometimes I have read books or by other writers and myself that you just want one little bit of information and you have an entire scene just to reveal this one line or this one thing. Well, in spite of what they tell you of show and not tell, not all elements are equally interesting or deserve as much attention. So what you can do in that case is just transfer that information to another scene. Here's another thing to consider. Is the scene active or reflective? Active, like the word says, is when something happens, right? An action. And reflective is when the character is pondering over the situation, or if it's relating it to another character, or if you are telling backstory or info dumps. So ideally, you should have a good balance between active and reflective scenes. But they also depend on what genre you're writing. It all goes back to the genre, right? If you're writing a thriller or an adventure story, it's a good idea to have a lot of action scenes. Like how many reflective scenes that Raiders of the Lost Ark have, right? Indiana Jones, he doesn't have a lot of time for reflection. But it is expected in literary fiction or women's fiction to have a lot more introspection and backstory. And my final test is, if I remove this scene, will it affect the flow of my novel? So I propose this test. Take out a scene, and then read the entire manuscript, and see if that scene was necessary. More often than not, I have found that when I'm doubting a scene and I take it out, it never comes back. Because the readers are smart. They can catch up with the action. They don't need an explanation about everything or how things came to be. Okay, mistake number 7. Abundance of cliches. One of the biggest problems that I have still now is that I always resort to what I like to call default mode, which is I put on paper the first thing that comes to mind. This is typical of first drafts, but you really should go back and try to change this as you go along. Or that's where it's useful to kind of critique partners that can point this out to you. And when I talk about cliches, I don't only mean stereotypical characters or predictable plots. I also mean the way you describe things or people. You probably have noticed that a lot of people talk about the eyes, the color of the eyes, or the eyes were glimmering, or the jaw clenched. And so think about this. If everybody's writing that, how can you stand out? Cliches are the antitheses of voice and style, in my opinion. So here are a few possible solutions. When you have to describe a character, think of traits outside the obvious that don't tell much about a person. Go beyond describing eye color or hair color. And here's some food for thought. Do all characters have to be good looking? I'd like to read a few of my favorite examples of descriptions. The first one is for Cornell Woolrich. I don't know if you guys know this author. He was a film noir writer. And a lot of his stuff was later produced by Alfred Hitchcock. This book is called Rendezvous in Black. Cameron's first name was McLean. Through some odd ancestral switch from front to back. It was of no consequence to anyone but himself anyway. He was too thin, and his face wore a chronically haggard look, probably due to this fact. His cheekbones stood out and his cheeks stood in. His manner was a mixture of uncertainty, followed by flurries of hasty action, followed by more uncertainty, as if he were already regretting the just preceding action. He always acted new at any given proceeding, as if he were undertaking them for the first time, even then when they were old and he should have been used to them. There must have been a time when his clothing had been at least passable, if nothing more than that. But he must have been entirely alone when that happened, because no one else could ever remember having seen him at such a time. On the present occasion, his shirt hadn't been changed in far too many days, and it wasn't only your eyes that told you that. This is from The Daughter of Fortune by Isabel Allende. Everyone is born with some special talent, and Eliza Summers discovered early on that she had two: a good sense of smell and a good memory. She used the first to earn a living, and the second to recall her life, if not in precise detail, at least with an astrologer's poetic vagueness. I like that. From The Storyteller by Jodi Picoult. There were always boys buzzing around Daria. She was beautiful, a tall and graceful ballet dancer with long, dark eyelashes and a little bow of a mouth. I was nowhere near as pretty as she was, but I figured the boys who buzzed around Daria couldn't all have her as their girlfriend. There would be some heartbroken fellow left over for me, and he would be so taken with my wit that he wouldn't notice my crooked front tooth or the way my belly pooched out a tiny bit in the front of my skirt. This is for My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. And Nino, there was something that confused me and perhaps saddened me. That stammer, the pallor, the purple that had suddenly swallowed his eyes. How handsome he was, so languid, and yet how much I disliked his languor. Lila, too, at a certain point, had seemed very beautiful to me. In general, I was the pretty one, while she was skinny, like a salted anchovy. She gave off an odor of wildness. She had a long face, narrow at the temples, framed by two bands of smooth black hair. Okay, and this is from The 100-Year-Old Man Who Climbed Out the Window and Disappeared by Jonas Jonassen. The station waiting room was almost empty when Alan shuffled in. Almost. On the right were two ticket windows, one closed. Behind the other sat a little man with small round glasses, thin hair combed to one side, and a uniform vest. The man gave an irritated look as he raised his eyes from his computer screen. Perhaps the current crowd was too much for him, because over in the corner stood a young man of slight build with long, greasy blonde hair, a scraggly beard, and a jean jacket with the words "Never Again" on the back. Perhaps the young man was illiterate, since he was pulling at the door to the handicapped restroom, as if the sign "Out of Order" in black lettering against an orange-colored background had no meaning. And my last, this is from The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. It seemed to me that Fermín Romero de Torres, or whatever his true name was, longed for light-hearted conversation almost as much as he longed for a hot bath, a plate of stew, and a clean change of clothes. I got him going for a while as I waited for my pain to subside. It wasn't very difficult, because all the man needed was a nod at the right moment and someone who appeared to be listening. And this is my last mistake. Mistake number 8. Rushed or predictable endings. At some point, when I was writing my first draft, I realized it was too long. So what did I do? I rushed to the ending. What a mistake this was. A reader will forget a slow opening, a sagging middle, but never an unsatisfactory ending. In my rush, I made another mistake. I wrote a very predictable and cliche ending, one that I would like to call the airport tension scene. You know how in romantic comedies, one lover is chasing another one through a crowded airport to prevent that loved one from taking an airplane and leaving forever? Yeah, I wrote that one. Except that it was on a bus. Not on an airplane, yeah. It was pretty bad. This is a very contrived source of drama because, you know, you can take the other plane, right? Possible solutions. Don't sacrifice your ending in order to make your manuscript shorter. It's better to come from the middle or from your opening. A good story comes full circle. You may use elements from your opening and use them in your ending. In the final version of my novel, I have my protagonist thinking of her father at the beginning. What a liar he is and this and that. Well, at the end, she's thinking about him again in better terms, but she's thinking about him. So it comes full circle, ideally. Think of the theme of your book and what you want to say about the world. This may give you a direction to follow and on how to end your story. And there's a really good book that you can read that explains this concept called The Moral Premise by Stanley Williams, where he explains all about theme and how your book has two stories, you know, your external story and then the theme, which is the internal story of the book. So it's really good. The ending should be appropriate to the genre you're writing. My original ending belonged to a romantic comedy, not to a family saga, which was the genre I was writing. In conclusion, my initial mistakes were classic pitfalls of first drafts: misleading openings, one-dimensional characters, unrealistic reactions, too many ideas in one story, erratic flashbacks, inconsequential scenes, cliche descriptions, and predictable ending. But that's okay, because the first draft is the writer telling himself the story. You learn a lot from first drafts, not just what your story is going to be, but also the craft of writing. Revision is when your story takes the right shape. It's where you come up with an appropriate ending, where you flesh out your characters, when you get rid of all those scenes that you don't need, and when your story comes into focus. Oh, and also, where you wrap it all up with a brilliant ending. As with any other skill, like playing the piano, dancing, or roller skating, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. Thank you.